Hey guys, my name is Zach Lawrence, and this week's projects are going over the Arab Spring and the potential effects that could have on the countries that were affected. So for those of you who don't know, to start off, the Arab Spring was a pro-democratic movement that swept through the Middle East. It's starting in late 2010, early 2011, and overall 17 countries were affected. So I wanted to look into more specifically the effect that this movement has had on women's rights, and if the movement towards democracy in the Middle East has had a positive or a negative or neutral impact on the rights and lives of women who are living in the Middle East. So one reason that the Arab Spring was so prevalent in the media was, in my mind, because women played such an important role in all the protests that occurred, and they were also very visible, which isn't something you see very often in Middle Eastern countries. So women were taking lead roles in the protests and even the rioting and the civil wars that were taking place in many of the countries, and many believed that this would have a positive impact on the rights of women in the Middle East because they received a lot more respect for the role that they played in the protests and were also activist leaders and a lot more at the forefront of the battle as opposed to in the background where we're used to seeing them in countries in the Middle East. So of the 17 countries affected by the Arab Spring that I mentioned earlier, only 12 of them experienced major unrest, the ones I've listed here: Tunisia, Syria, Iran, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman, Algeria, and Yemen. So I wanted to particularly take a look at these countries because they would have seen more governmental change and maybe a turnover of power. And if that's the case, then maybe alterations to the Constitution in terms of rights for women, and maybe social changes that would allow more acceptance of women. So of these 12 countries that experienced major unrest, 4 of them were able to remove the previous ruling powers in their country and replace them with new governments. So I wanted to see if that introduced a positive or negative change in terms of women's rights, and just really for life in general, if they were able to make progress. So these countries are, from left to right here, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and then Yemen. The first country I looked into here was Tunisia. Now Tunisia has a long history of being a leader in the Arab world in terms of women's rights, so I wanted to do this one first. It was formerly under the rule of Zine el-Abidine Ben Ali, who was an autocratic ruler within the country, but that government has since been. So, as I said before, Tunisia was formerly under autocratic rule, but it is currently under the leadership of the Islamist Ennahda Party, which was the successor to the previous regime after the turnover during the Arab Spring. One thing that has set Tunisia apart in the past from other Arab countries in the Middle East was its Code of Personal Status, which was a series of laws that were passed in the 1950s, and these laws did great things for women, including raising the minimum age of marriage and giving women equal rights in divorce. So at this time, that was pretty much unheard of in Arabic countries, and it's one thing that's kind of been a cultural staple within Tunisia. So for that reason, Tunisia has always been fairly progressive in terms of women's rights, especially amongst Middle Eastern countries. However, since the Islamist Party has come to power in Tunisia since the end of the Arab Spring, the government has made modifications to the Constitution, and in these new modifications, vocabulary is used, which some people were not very happy about, that refers to women as complementary to men. So it seems like this new government is actually taking steps backwards in terms of respect for women and the rights that they might see in the future. Egypt was one of the countries I feel was portrayed the most in the media, simply because there was a very violent struggle against the previous ruler, Mubarak, and the government has actually turned over multiple times since then. It goes through periods of being under military rule, and then a new leader comes to power and he gets ousted as well. So Egypt has been at the forefront of the media coverage of the Arab Spring. And if you look at my first bullet point here, it'll show you that there have been 3 actual rulers since Mubarak fell from power, and 2 circumstances of military rule since then. And the current ruler, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has actually been compared in multiple circumstances to the rule that Egypt experienced under Mubarak, so it's questionable as to how long he's actually going to stay in power there. However, since we've seen all these new rulers in Egypt, rights for women have improved very little. In fact, in a UN poll that occurred in 2013, Egypt listed last at the end of a list of 22 countries in the Middle East, so it was ranked behind countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia in terms of rights for women. And a big reason for this is there are high rates of sexual harassment in Egypt. In fact, 99.3% of women and girls report experiencing sexual harassment at some point in their lives in Egypt. So 99.3%, that's pretty close to everybody. Also, female genital mutilation and violence against women are fairly common throughout the country. One instance of a feminist movement that recently occurred in Egypt that kind of shows where things are at right now was the Million Woman March. And actually, although it was called the Million Woman March, hardly 1,000 women actually showed up, and it was responded to almost immediately by men coming and shouting anti-feminist slurs. In fact, one I have here says, one of the men was heard shouting, "Men are men and women are women, and that will never change, so go home, that's where you belong." So that kind of outlines the current feminist struggle in Egypt right now, not looking so. The next country I looked at was Libya, and this was another one we saw quite a lot in the media, particularly because of this man, Gaddafi, who refused to give up his power in light of the protests that were occurring in Libya, and because of this, a civil war actually sparked that lasted many years, but he eventually was. And many actually claim that rule under Gaddafi was actually beneficial for women, as they gained a fair amount of rights during his rule, which lasted several decades, but this was primarily due to his wife, who was a feminist activist, you could say, but she was primarily looking for the betterment of her husband's regime and women who were elite in the country being able to use their power more effectively. In addition, Libya is also one of the countries we've seen in the post-Arab Spring that has actually kind of moved backwards in terms of women's rights. For example, in 2013, the former restrictions that were put on polygamy that outlawed it were lifted, and women then became forbidden from marrying foreigners, so they're actually in the process of losing rights under the new government. And 57% of women in Libya today still report that they wouldn't feel safe leaving their homes without permissions from their husbands, which I think makes it safe to say that this is a fairly regressive society for women that is not getting much better at the moment. Next we have Yemen, which was particularly interesting to me because it is one of the most repressive societies for women, but it's where we saw some of the most assertive activism from women, so one would think that their presence in the media would make them more respected within Yemeni society, but that has not been the case, as we will see. The previous government under Ali Abdullah Saleh was the one that was ousted during the Arab Spring, and the protests that occurred in Yemen during the Arab Spring didn't initially start as a pro-democratic movement. They were just kind of looking for improvements to unemployment and healthcare, things like that, but it eventually did result in the ousting of the government. Since then, we haven't seen much change in Yemen. They still see very high rates of child marriage. Most women are married by the time they turn 15 or 16, but it's not uncommon to see young girls married at the age of 8 or 9. And while there have been attempts to raise the age of minimum marriage for women, many use it as a way to just get by, make ends meet, because there is often a dowry received if you marry off a daughter, for example, so many families do that just to make a living. So even though Yemen is currently under democratic rule, it is still one of the worst countries in the Middle East for women. As it says here, they are looking at a 35% literacy rate among women in the country, and they're denied basic rights such as being allowed to marry without the permission of male guardians. If you're going to get married, you have to have the permission of your father. So this is just another example where democracy hasn't particularly helped the women. So really, it doesn't look like the Arab Spring had much of a positive impact at all for these countries in terms of the development of women's rights. However, there were some other countries I wanted to mention. These two, Morocco and Algeria, were not countries that experienced an overturn of governments, but they have seen a bit of a rise in women's rights since the events of the Arab Spring, and they were two that experienced major protests within their country. So in Morocco, for example, a 2011 referendum made amendments to the constitution that made, or at least attempted to make, men and women equals in every sense of the word, whether it be in the workplace or socially. Technically, in Morocco, men and women are supposed to be exact equals now, and this occurred at the same time as a democratic shift. So this goes against the notion that we've seen in other countries that democracy and women's rights have nothing to do with each other. And in Algeria, in 2011, a quota was put into the constitution that 30% of the members of parliament had to be women. And Algeria has been a democratic state since the 80s, so even though these didn't occur side by side, it could be argued that the fact that Algeria is a democratic state played a role in the development of this quote. So just to wrap things up here, are a couple of the conclusions I made doing this research about the Arab Spring. It looks like there is no correlation between democratic governments and the development of rights for women, although we did see exceptions in Morocco and Algeria. The four big ones I looked at that it saw democratic movements within their country that actually blossomed and became governments didn't see much change for women. And the Arab Spring in general had very little impact on countries' views towards women and the rights that they achieved. And that is all I've got for you. Thanks for watching.